This is Dayuma. Dayuma is from the Waorani, an indigenous nation in Ecuador. Sometime in the 1940s, when she was still quite young, Dayuma fled the Waorani to escape violence. She spent some years working on an hacienda. In the mid-1950s, Dayuma was contacted by Rachel Saint, a missionary from the US who had been trained by the Summer Institute of Linguistics, or SIL for short. The two became friends, and Saint started learning the Waorani language from her. Eventually, Dayuma converted to Christianity. A few years later, in what is known as Operation Auroux, 5 other missionaries, including Rachel Saint's brother, attempted to establish contact with the Waorani. It did not go well. The Waorani killed all 5 missionaries. The story galvanized US evangelicals, and it stirred up a bit of a media frenzy. In 1957, Saint and Dayuma toured the US. They were featured on the TV show This Is Your Life, and Dayuma gave her testimony on stage at Billy Graham's New York Crusade in front of a packed Madison Square Garden. All of this secured an outpouring of funding for further missionary work. Here were 2 women, a missionary and the person she had led to Christ, who had suffered from the violence of the Waorani, and yet both still wanted to go back and share the gospel with the very people who had perpetrated that violence. For evangelicals, it was a compelling story that highlighted the value of SIL's missionary work. But if you ask people from SIL, they'll tell you that they aren't missionaries. They'll tell you that they're linguists. The connection between linguistics and Christian missionary work goes back a long ways. If you watched the video on the language parasite, we talked about how, arguably, modern linguistics arose from 19th century efforts to compare different languages and determine if they had some kind of shared ancestry, doing with languages basically the same thing Darwin was doing with biological species. And we mentioned how one of the things that made this possible was the publication of a number of books that compiled a bunch of data on a bunch of different languages. Data that used to be dispersed here and there was now available in a single place, which made it a lot easier for scholars to compare and contrast languages. What I didn't mention, though, is that a sizable chunk of that data traces back to the work of Christian missionaries. Data they had gathered over the previous few centuries, especially during the so-called Age of Exploration. So the contribution of missionaries to linguistics was significant from the start. How significant is hard to say, but it's probably not all that crazy to think that linguistics would look a lot different from what it is today if it hadn't been for those Christian missionaries. A lot of that work was essentially didactic, teaching material. Basically, missionaries would try to learn the language of whoever it was they were trying to reach, and they would write down what they learned about the language for the next generation of missionaries. Their work has its share of problems. For starters, these missionaries were trained in the Greco-Latin tradition. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, but it meant that they were trained to study languages in a certain way, to look for the kinds of things that existed in Latin and Greek. When they encountered languages that were completely different from anything they had encountered before, sometimes they may have tried a little too hard to make those languages fit into the Greco-Latin mold, like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Not that they were entirely oblivious to this problem. A famous example of someone who was keenly aware of the issue is the Jesuit Antonio del Rincon. In 1595, Rincon published his Arte Mexicana, a grammar of Nahuatl that analyzes the language on its own terms, rather than trying to make sense of it through the Greco-Latin mold. In fact, in the introduction, he explicitly states that languages are so different from one another that it's impossible to have a single model that will work for all of them at the same time. Admittedly, though, in his time Rincon was probably more of the exception than the rule. He was a native speaker of Nahuatl, and many of his Jesuit peers stuck much more closely to the Greco-Latin model than he did. Beyond that bias towards the Greco-Latin model, another problem you encounter in the work of these missionaries is the kind of value judgment many of them had against the languages, and more importantly the people, they encountered. For example, speaking of European missionaries in North America, the late historian Edward Gray wrote that, quote, Jesuits generally derided the languages, characterizing the polysynthetic character of American languages as a symptom of social decay. In keeping with their heathen character, missionaries widely assumed that indigenous people had failed to impose grammatical discipline on their languages. Obviously, that's all kinds of wrong. But if we focus very narrowly on the language sciences, the issue it raises is how their contempt for these languages might have impacted the way they analyze them. Feelings don't care about facts, as it were. The biases we hold can color how we interpret the facts, which ones we're more likely to notice, which ones we're more likely to ignore, and so on. But in the larger scale of things, these are just minor issues related to whether or not they did a good job analyzing the languages they encountered. Obviously, the bigger story isn't that. The bigger story is how these missionaries were part of a much bigger colonial enterprise that caused immense harm, destroying and subjugating many cultures on their path. For some missionaries, that connection between evangelism and colonialism was quite explicit. For example, David Livingstone, who in over 30 years in Africa managed to convert exactly one person, not two, not three, one, he wrote, quote, "Sending the gospel to the heathen must include much more than is implied in the usual picture of a missionary, namely, a man going about with a Bible under his arm. The promotion of commerce ought to be especially attended to, as this, more speedily than anything else, demolishes that sense of isolation which heathenism engenders, and makes the tribes feel themselves mutually dependent on and mutually beneficial to each other. For neither civilization nor Christianity can be promoted alone. In fact, they are inseparable." The founder of SIL, California-born William Cameron Townsend, saw things differently. For him, the work of a missionary was very much about a man going about with a Bible under his arm, and he wanted that Bible to be in the language of the people he was trying to reach. In the late 1910s, Townsend traveled to Guatemala to sell Spanish Bibles for a US-based publishing house. After a few years, he joined an evangelical mission that was trying to minister to the indigenous Caxical people. While Christianity was gaining traction in the country overall, it wasn't bringing in many indigenous converts. Townsend believed that the main reason for this was first that the indigenous people were illiterate, and second, that even if they were to become literate, they still wouldn't have access to the Bible in their own language. So he set out to address those two issues. In a way, this is a very Protestant way of going about things. If we compare it to Catholic missionary work, we see two different trends emerge. Obviously, this is going to be a massive oversimplification, because what we're talking about encompasses a wide variety of things over multiple centuries. But essentially, in the Catholic tradition, overall it's been more about inducting people into a community of faith and practice. It didn't matter all that much if converts were illiterate, and it didn't matter all that much if the language used wasn't the native language of the people. If there's some regional lingua franca that most people can more or less understand, that's good enough. It also tended to be a bit more of a top-down approach. If you look at how the Catholic Church spread throughout Europe, you'll find many examples of missionaries targeting the social elite and political leadership first, and once they converted them, the rest followed from there. They replicated that same approach when they arrived in the Americas, focusing on the languages spoken by the elite, like Nahuatl, which was the language of nobility and had become a lingua franca for the elite classes of much of Mesoamerica. So they focused primarily on those kinds of languages and less on the smaller, less prestigious languages spoken by commoners. Again, these are just general trends. It doesn't mean that they didn't preach to commoners at all or didn't study any of their languages at all. In addition to that, the Catholic Church was also rather reluctant when it came to translating the Bible into local vernaculars, in part because they feared that if you left people to their own devices, they might end up interpreting the Bible in ways that the Church would consider heretical. In the Protestant tradition, on the other hand, and again, this is a huge oversimplification, missionary work has been less about induction into a community and more about individual faith. And this has gone hand in hand with literacy. Not just literacy, but if you want each person to be individually persuaded by the gospel, you want that gospel to be in the language that resonates the most with them, namely their mother tongue. It's what Townsend would later call the language of the heart. It wasn't enough to share the gospel in a lingua franca that people understood. It needed to be in the language they identified with the most. So Townsend wanted to bring literacy to the Caxical and translate the Bible into their language. Over the years, he realized that if he wanted to do this right, he would need actual linguistic expertise. The evangelical missionaries of his day weren't Jesuits. They didn't usually have that kind of higher education or formal academic training. Townsend just didn't have the expertise he needed to be able to study Ketchikel and translate the Bible into it. So he reached out to some of the more influential figures in U.S. linguistics, like Edward Sapir. Leveraging their advice, he founded the Summer Institute of Linguistics, or SIL for short, in the early 1930s. The aim of SIL was to train missionaries in linguistics, with the end goal of translating the Bible into the languages they encountered. As SIL grew, the end goal would become to do this in all of the languages of the world, thus accomplishing the Great Commission, which is the instruction that Jesus gave his disciples to spread the gospel to the entire planet. One of the first students at SIL was Kenneth Pike. Pike would become a renowned linguist in his own right, later becoming a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the Linguistic Society of America, of which he became president for a while. Pike was instrumental in professionalizing SIL and turning it into a legitimate linguistics program. But SIL is only half the picture. When Townsend started to expand his activities into Mexico, he ran into a problem. The government was supportive of SIL working there to help build literacy among indigenous groups, but they didn't allow missionary work in their education system. So if SIL was a missionary organization, they had to go. The solution Townsend came up with was a kind of two-headed Janus-like structure. On one side you had SIL, but SIL would now be an academic organization focused on training people in linguistics and promoting literacy. And on the other side you had Wycliffe Bible Translators, a missionary organization focused on translating the Bible and spreading the gospel. There's a huge amount of overlap between the two, but technically they're two different organizations. Since SIL was no longer a missionary organization, not officially anyway, they were allowed to continue their work in Mexico. Over the years, this dual setup allowed Townsend to switch back and forth when convenient. Through Wycliffe, he appealed to evangelical congregations and wealthy evangelical donors in the US to get funding for his missionary work. Through SIL, he got academic recognition, which in turn allowed him to appeal to the US government for public funding and support. And he wasn't the only one who found that dual setup convenient. It was also convenient for various political actors in Latin America. Whenever there was political opposition to SIL because of its missionary work, the government could just say, "No, look, SIL's an academic endeavor. They're here to document languages and promote literacy. They aren't missionaries." And on the other hand, whenever it was politically expedient to criticize the Catholic Church, political actors could say that by supporting SIL, they were supporting an evangelical group that competed with the Catholic Church. That duality is also reflected in how SIL missionaries make their case towards the rest of linguistics. They tend to emphasize the linguistic side of their work, and when the missionary side is brought up, it's often minimized or dismissed through a bit of semantic quibbling. Apparently, in some evangelical circles, a missionary is specifically someone who founds new churches. And since they don't do that, more on that in the next section, then by that definition, they're not missionaries. For those of us who aren't evangelical and use the more common definition of missionary, that explanation can seem like a bit of a stretch, like they're trying to get off on a technicality. After all, their purpose is still to convert people to Christianity. In the more common definition of the term, they're undoubtedly missionaries. Linguist? Sure, but also missionaries. That dual identity courses through all levels of SIL, from the organizational structure all the way down to the individual linguists/missionaries. Janus through and through. Townsend's legacy is mixed, to say the least, and his story is complicated, caught up in many of the big political upheavals of his day. His complicated legacy can perhaps best be summed up with this little factoid. In 1972, the Inter-American Indian Institute bestowed on Townsend the title of Benefactor of the Linguistically Isolated Population of America. In 1980, just 8 years later, the Institute passed a resolution to strip him of that title. When that resolution passed, many of the delegates stood up and gave the resolution a standing ovation. In his early years, compared to other U.S. evangelicals, Townsend was rather progressive in his support for indigenous people. Townsend's idea of missionary work was for a missionary to just spread the gospel and then leave the rest up to the people. The missionary wasn't supposed to start a church, lead a flock, or insist on changing the culture. He was just supposed to spread the gospel. If there was a church, it should be founded and led by the indigenous people themselves. Townsend also valued indigenous cultures, at least in the aspects that didn't conflict too much with his version of Christianity: their clothing, food, music, and so on. All of this was in stark contrast with what most U.S. fundamentalists wanted. For the most part, they were uncomfortable with things like indigenous clothing, music, and whatnot, and thought that churches should be led by U.S.-based pastors, not local indigenous ones. So, in that context, you can see how Townsend would seem like a voice in favor of indigenous rights. But, over the course of his life, things changed quite a bit. Put it this way, when the big U.S. multinationals, like oil companies and whatnot, when they arrived in Latin America, it was more often with the help of missionaries than with the help of soldiers. And when soldiers were involved, it seemed that SIL was never too far away. All of those things were intertwined in one big messy ball of thread called colonialism. To read about the history of SIL is to read about people like the Rockefellers, or things like the US military and the CIA. In Barbados in 1971, the World Council of Churches, an international Christian organization that promotes ecumenism, held a conference in which they discussed allegations that SIL, among other missionary groups, was contributing to the destruction of indigenous populations. In the declaration they drafted during that conference, they demanded that the missions, quote, halt both the theft of Indian property by religious missionaries who appropriate labor, lands, and natural resources as their own, and the indifference in the face of expropriation by third parties. They concluded that, quote, to the degree that religious missions do not assume these minimal obligations, they too must be held responsible by default for crimes of ethnocide and connivance with genocide. These aren't small charges. People from SIL will point out that they've never been formally found guilty of anything. In 1975, a formal charge was filed against them to the Committee on Ethics of the American Anthropological Association. After examining the case, the committee exonerated SIL. But that wasn't enough to shake the feeling that there was some connection between SIL and some of the worst actions taken by either the US or local governments. In one case, it led to the death of an SIL missionary. In 1981, Chet Bitterman was in Colombia to work on the Carijona language. He was abducted and later executed by M19, a revolutionary nationalist movement that apparently believed SIL was a front for the CIA. Or at least that's the more common narrative. If you try to dig into it a bit more, it rapidly turns into one of those bewildering whodunit stories like JFK or Epstein. Townsend's legacy wasn't the only one to fall into disrepute, or at least to be more openly challenged than it once was. A few years after touring the US, Rachel Saint managed to go live with the Waorani and start ministering to them. At the same time, extractive industries like oil and logging were eyeing Waorani territory and beginning to encroach on it. Not that this was the first time. In the late 19th century, the abundance of rubber in the region had led to a rush of foreign companies seeking to make a profit. The local indigenous groups, including the Waorani, were violently suppressed and forced into slavery in what is now known as the Putumayo genocide. In 2024, Demonte Nenquimo, a member of the Waorani and influential indigenous activist, published a book entitled We Will Not Be Saved. In the US, the title was changed to We Will Be Jaguars, since apparently it's too abrasive for US audiences to hear that some people don't need and don't want their saving, he said, struggling to keep the snark in check. Anyway, Nenquimo frames Saint's work with the Waorani as destructive. With photographic evidence, she argues that Saint had welcomed and collaborated with oil executives to start extracting oil on Waorani lands, destroying their traditional environment. In the description, I'll leave some references to books that explore these issues of SIL, extractive industries, and colonialism in more detail. along with a recent video from the channel Genetically Modified Skeptic, which discusses this angle in more detail. But what about Townsend's legacy for linguistics? On that front, a different picture begins to emerge. SIL's primary contribution to linguistics is the fact that they've documented a significant amount of languages. When it comes to small, indigenous languages in remote places that are hard to access, there's a lot we probably wouldn't know if it weren't for them. SIL may also provide more concrete material assistance for other linguists. Like, if you're a researcher and you want to work on a language in the Amazon, and they're the ones that have the logistics to get there, the ability to provide accommodation and whatnot, you may end up relying on SIL at one point or another. They've also developed software for language documentation for things like organizing and annotating audio data, managing lexical data, or just typing in various languages, all of which might be useful for linguists who aren't affiliated with them. And then there's the more policy-based and public-facing side of things. They're involved in a number of projects to promote literacy and to protect endangered languages. They've partnered with some big UN agencies like UNESCO or ECOSOC. They run the publication Ethnologue, which is probably the most extensive database for basic demographic information on the world's languages. They're also the language coding agency for the ISO 6393 standard, which gives languages a 3-letter code that is then used for a variety of practical purposes. For example, just as a tidbit, if you want to add a new language to Wikipedia, your language needs to have an ISO 6393 code. If you don't have one, you'd have to ask SIL. Their role is by no means small, and linguistics as a field has benefited from their work. If we align our stance with that of indigenous activists like Nenquimo, this puts us in an awkward position. The very thing that has allowed us to study these languages is also the thing that is destroying them. This blurry cohabitation between linguistics and missionary work, exemplified today by SIL, is of course a source of controversy. For someone like me who's very critical of missionary work, it can be tempting to just single out SIL and focus exclusively on the religious aspect. But at the risk of being accused of whataboutism and equivocation, I think it might be a bit more insightful to take a step back and situate SIL in the broader context it operates in. Consider that if SIL is in the position it's in, it's because there is nobody else to do it. If governments turn to SIL for literacy or revitalization programs, or if ISO turns to SIL to manage its language codes, it's because they're the ones who have the expertise and systems in place to do it. They're filling that niche because no one else has, or will. In other words, to criticize SIL for filling those roles is also to criticize linguistics as a whole for not rising up to the challenge in the first place. It's a known problem. In 1991, linguist Michael Krauss delivered a lecture at the Linguistic Society of America in which he famously said, quote, "Obviously, we must do some serious rethinking of our priorities, lest linguistics go down in history as the only science that presided obliviously over the disappearance of 90% of the very field to which it is dedicated." Fortunately, his words didn't fall on deaf ears. Many heeded his warning. And since then, there's been an increase in efforts to document the many languages of the world and assist in revitalization projects and whatnot. So, things are headed in the right direction. Some might say it's too little too late, others might say better late than never, but either way, it's never a waste to try and participate in those efforts and push policy a bit further in that direction. More broadly, if we don't disambiguate what exactly SIL's faults are, it can be tempting to explain away some of their faults as being the result of their religious nature, when they're really not. And in fact, some of those faults are ubiquitous in academia and society as a whole. We mentioned some of the issues with missionaries in the age of exploration and colonialism. One was that they sometimes tried too hard to apply the Greco-Latin model where it didn't apply. Another was that they looked down on these languages and the people who spoke them. In one word, they were Eurocentric. But is that unique to missionaries? Hardly. It's an accusation you could levy against even the least religious language scholars of the time. For SIL in the 20th century, a lot of what they seem to be guilty of is what David Stoll called a Hail Caesar approach. Essentially, as long as they could go ahead with their own mission of evangelizing, They were willing to turn a blind eye to all the bad things their work could lead to, and collaborate with larger destructive forces like extractive industries or authoritarian regimes, and so on. But is that something they're uniquely guilty of? A non-religious linguist would also struggle with things like access if they took too strong a stance against government policies. They might find it tempting to give in to small compromises if it means they can keep on doing their work. What about the linguists who used military funding for the early research on computational linguistics? Did they support warfare, or was it yet another case of "Hail Caesar," disregarding the consequences their work could have downstream as long as they were allowed to continue doing it? What about those working on LLMs today? Do they support the disenfranchisement of large sections of the workforce, or is it yet another case of "Hail Caesar," just not feeling particularly responsible for the consequences your work can have, as long as you're allowed to continue doing it? There's a moral conundrum there that isn't specific to missionaries, but that courses through many aspects of society. Scientists who voice mild criticism of these issues are a dime a dozen. Scientists who will take a stronger stance and actually do something about it, those are few and far between. For contrast, take Louis Fry Richardson, a mathematician and physicist who was active in the first half of the 20th century, and who is known for his work on the so-called coastline paradox, as well as his work on meteorology. Richardson was a Quaker and a resolute pacifist. According to some accounts, when he discovered that his work on meteorology was useful for chemical weapons designers, he destroyed the findings he hadn't published yet, and he stopped working on that line of research. For him, whatever advances he could have made to scientific knowledge didn't outweigh the value of a human life. That's what it looks like when a person refuses to say "Hail Caesar." This isn't some moralistic, holier-than-thou conclusion on my part. The world's a complicated place, and I certainly don't have all the answers. Some would argue that what I'm suggesting here is supererogatory, beyond the call of duty, as it were. Like, yeah, it sucks that my work is being used for nasty purposes, but it's not my responsibility to do anything about it. Maybe that's valid, but I figured that if I'm in the Monte Nenquimo and a linguist shows up at my door, I'd probably much prefer it be someone with the moral backbone of a Louis Fry Richardson, someone whose ethical standards wouldn't allow them to pursue knowledge if it came at the expense of destroying my own community. I'd much prefer that than anyone who would turn a blind eye to the consequences of their actions. The way I see it, we need more Monte Nenquimos in this world, and we need more Louis Fry Richardsons, at the very least, just so that occasionally, every once in a while, we're reminded of what it looks like when a human being stands up and refuses to say "Hail Caesar."